So please join me in welcoming Aneesh Aneesh.
Thank you, President Brown, for inviting me to Santa Fe. I still fondly remember that magical year of contemplation, reading, writing, and eating out. I should have finished my book in that year, but New Mexican cuisine came in the way. So, global citizenship. This is a new project, as Michael was talking about my previous projects, and I'll mention them a little bit. Some of you must be thinking, global citizenship, what a flight of fancy. What conceit. The people who are going to be a little less kind might think it's too arrogant to even think such a thing. But hopefully, by the end of the lecture, you would see it's not as much a fancy as a kind of reality that's already taking shape, that's already happening. So let me just briefly talk about my first book. In Virtual Migration, I tackled the idea. You know, in the late 90s, there was a debate. American Engineering Association was up in arms against software professionals coming from India and other parts of Europe, Hungary, etc., to work in the US and occupying employment space. So I wrote this book. I compared, these programmers who were coming to the US, compared them with a kind of nascent, very, on online software development regime that was becoming reality at the time. And the part of the argument, at least one small argument, was that immigration controls against these software professionals are only going to push it online. And exactly that's what happened in, after 2001, when the research was finished. You have a great outsourcing debate and things like that. And software profession, actually now, most of your software that we use is globally developed by teams sitting in Beijing, in Bangalore, or in Arlington Heights in the US. So that was a book about global integration. And I'm trying to bring us to kind of, to make you kind of believe global citizenship is also possible. So global labor market has become reality, and, more or less, with barriers, for sure. But as we see that this, what I call virtual migration labor regime, circumvents the barriers to crossing the borders, and it negotiates national borders differently than an actual body that's crossing the border. Then after that, I wrote a book on call centers, the book conceived and written at SAR, most of it at least, in which I talk about the costs of global integration. We always talk about the digital divide, people who are not able to get access to all the resources that are available on the internet. But the success of global integration also has its costs, that just as we, if you remember earlier industrial times, we developed insurance schemes against industrial accidents and things like that. So we need to think about the information age in a similar fashion. What are the costs? So this brings out what happens to language, labor, and life when you're integrated in real time across the planet. So now, coming to global citizenship. So it's part reality, and you will see as my talk progresses, and I won't speak more than 40 minutes, I think I have been instructed. And because after that, people will start probably dozing off. But part of it is, of course, fancy. Part of it is a flight of fancy. But as you would realize, I will stay probably more on the reality part to make it more understandable. So there are two small puzzles I'm dealing with here. How does national citizenship, and citizenship is only national these days, right? Respond to pressures towards globalization? Just as I studied, labor migration, what technology does to globalization or to labor migration. And the second question is, what prompts a national government to relinquish its monopoly over citizenship? And you might think, we haven't heard of that thing. Like, is there any state, any government that's relinquishing its monopoly over citizenship? Actually, there are, and I think hopefully I'll be able to talk about it. So I'll start with three paradoxes of national citizenship. Why national citizenship has been in trouble for a while, since the rise of the nation state, in fact. And these three paradoxes still inform us. And some of the battles that are going on, even in this election year, you'll see are directly related to these paradoxes. So this is not just high academic talk about paradoxes and contradictions, but actually it has real effect on the ground. So three paradoxes relate to territory, identity, and the nation state itself. And after I have talked about them, I'll talk about how immigrants and minorities bear the brunt of these contradictions, these paradoxes, And after that, I'll talk about how citizenship is taking shape in the global age, and how we may, and if we want to influence it, which way we want to influence it towards, which way we want to push it towards. So let's begin with the paradox of territory. As you know, nation state has been, very successful. It has had many accomplishments. And one of the accomplishments was that somehow, through nationalism, it has been able to generate the kind of cohesiveness, solidarity that used to exist at the village level, at the community, small communities where everyone knows everyone else, right? So that's the anthropological spaces. When people studied, there was no communication beyond borders. The movement, physical movement, was also slower and recognizable. People always moved. There were less borders than in previous times. But when you scale it up, the territory, some things happen. Some things change drastically, and the nature of community changes immediately. What happens when you scale it up, then you are going to capture population, and that the whole notion of population emerges. Because these are no longer communities. These are no longer even, communities that speak the same language or share ethnicity, especially large territorial states like India or the US or China or Russia. What it captures, captures a lot of abstract populations. So that's why scholars like Benedict Anderson talk about nations can only be imagined communities. They can never be real communities. Because out of 300 million people in the US, how many can we really know? Actually, I asked my class once, and the highest number one reached was 2,000 Facebook friends. And I thought, wow, that's 2,000 Facebook friends. That's a really high number. So let's stop at 5,000. Maybe we know 5,000 people directly. But beyond that, reaching 300 million people is hard. But as 9/11 reminds us, somehow the entire nation imagined itself to be hurt by the event, right? So there is something about that national imagination of solidarity, and that's where the success of this national nation-state lies. But there also lies a couple of failures, and then I'll talk about them. So this emergence through the territorial communicative integration, through transport, through railroads, through now the internet and radio, that integration captures a lot of people, but not everyone fits the norm of that national, what you call, I would say, the normative value, or not a normative ethnicity, or normative language, right? So there will be a lot of populations that are going to fail the test of being true nationals. And it's almost impossible not to have it this way, because territorial integration is going to, I'll give you the example of India, which has been my focus of research. So when India was integrated, and the nation state integrates differently, and I don't want to go, but in Q&A, if you can ask me about the difference between empires and nation state. Nation state is a very different animal. So in India, when it's territorially integrated, you have about 100 language-speaking communities, actually more. 22 are recognized, and I think 15 or 16 are official Indian languages, right? So there are populations that cannot even talk with each other, but they end up being part of the same nation. You also have different ethnicities within India. You also have, what Indian government calls aborigines, aboriginal people. So similarly, it goes on, the list goes on of the people who are collected in this container called the nation state. Now the second one is, so before I come to the second paradox, but this territorial scale and the ideal of ethnic cohesion together gives rise to anomalous populations that don't. And of course, these populations occupy this weird category. They are neither the enemy nor the criminal, but they don't fit. They're not liked. And the election year this year is also reminding us of that these people are neither the enemy nor the criminal. Who they are, what are they? They just don't fit. And of course, as history suggests, that there have been genocidal temptations related to those anomalous populations, right? The second paradox is that of identity the nation state has to deal with. And the paradox is what we call ascriptive or inherited citizenship versus voluntary citizenship. See, the nation state again is founded on this paradox of identity, that we as citizens, so on the one hand, we would say, okay, I'm bound by my ancestry, ethnicity, and culture. My membership in this nation is based on my inherited attributes. That's one notion of identity, that we feel, speak the same language, we enjoy the same symbolic parts of our culture. But there's another notion that nation state has too, paradoxical, which is that all democratic constitutional states have this idea that your membership is voluntary in this. You are neither inherited and no one forced you into citizenship. It's not a forced relationship with the state. That is, you are the addressee of the law, but also its author. That, if you go back to Kant and Rousseau, the thinkers of the Enlightenment times. So this membership is about I'm free and my membership in this nation is voluntary. Now, the nation state has never been able to resolve these paradoxes. And these paradoxes, let's see how it plays out. So, for example, one solution that emerged is the naturalization of citizenship through naturalization. That is, you're not born, or you're not born in the territory, and you do not ancestrally belong to the country. But if you look at it, the Naturalization Act of 1790, for example, it says you can naturalize at that time, but you had to be a free white person. And the category of white did not include a lot of whites today. And so it's hard to say. It sounds like a Republican model, but at the same time, it's using ascriptive category. See the confusion within the Constitution of 1790. Then we have the Japanese, for example, another example is Japanese American internment camps in 1942. And 2/3 of the people interned were formal American citizens. But why were they interned and put in camps? Because there is a confusion. The state doesn't know which criteria to apply, or probably it does. It's applying the ethnic criteria, because somehow Japanese ethnicity doesn't fit the normative model of the nation state. So it can, in times of crisis, you can scapegoat these identities and these people. So the nation state always, because it's territorially integrated. So the two principles through which we gain citizenship, primarily, there are other ways, and I'll come to them, are jus soli, which is the law of the soil, and jus sanguinis, the right of blood. That is, either the US follows the jus soli model. If you're born here, you're immediately a citizen. But you cannot be a citizen just because your father was an American. So jus soli is much more pronounced. Although there's a kind of modified jus soli everywhere that's being followed, just such as in Ireland. But many countries follow jus sanguinis model, that ancestry and inheritance of that culture. So India follows the right of blood model, jus sanguinis model. So if you're just born in India, you don't gain Indian citizenship automatically. So both jus soli and jus sanguinis are models where citizenship is purely by accident, the accident of birth. So unlike the democratic constitutional state, where it's a voluntary citizenship, it's not by accident, it's through a decision. Both these strong norms of citizenship, what I call strong citizenship, are based on that. The third paradox is that the nation states, again, are, if you think that nation states define themselves according to a religion, many countries say, okay, this is their state religion. Some other defined by the ethnicity. Some states, like the US, it really emphasizes the language part, If you don't speak English, go back home, right? Some countries have race and patriotism, sovereignty, all these models. But those are ascriptive model again. But actually, if you look at the nation state, how they actually function, they more and more follow, especially democracies and even dictatorships. They follow the same scripts of development, same models of rights, same models of scientific education, science and education. So if you see, textbook adoptions, for example, in different countries, and people have charted it, people have figured out that it's been rising everywhere. So all states start looking and doing similar things. So again, these paradoxes, immigrants bear the burden of these contradictions. So from time to time in history, you will always see the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, for example, or the National Origins Quota of 1924 in the US, where when Southern Eastern Europeans started becoming the majority by 1900s, the law was passed and their population was pushed back so Northern Europeans could gain control. You have the same ethnic model, but in the Immigration Act of 1965 was actually, it's a post-World War II act, and it's most liberal in some sense. It does allow, it overturns a lot of earlier racial bias in the law. But then you have Arizona, immigration debates of 2010. I think I'm trying to read what this woman is saying. It's saying, no, baby, it's not illegal to be who you are. It's just going to feel like it is. Then you have a lot of fees that, part of my first book, The High-Skilled Immigration, they have increased a lot of fee on H-1B visas. Why? To control low-skilled immigration on the border. They're using that fee to directly funnel the money there. So immigrants have always been this confusion, this conflation, this problem, this unresolved paradox of the nation state. They have to deal with this problem. So what are the responses to these paradoxes? I think first response we can probably rightfully call it human rights as opposed to citizen rights. So citizen rights mean you are either a citizen or a non-citizen, right? So you have either rights as a citizen or you don't. But human rights includes you no matter what. It doesn't mean. So it's a much bigger umbrella. It's not a national club. So human rights regime that rises after the Second World War, and many scholars have talked about how the citizenship is changing its ground. There's a ground shifting under citizenship, and it's moving more towards a human rights model. Why? Because they have found out that more and more non-citizens are getting the rights, kind of rights that were not afforded to them earlier. So a sociologist has done research in Europe, and they have seen how Turkish immigrants into 5 different countries in Europe, how they are assimilated and how they are incorporated into those regimes. And it's a fascinating analysis. So human rights is a big thing. Many cosmopolitan models also include human rights as important, because they think the UN Charter, which talks about sovereign nation states, when we are looking at some abuses, disasters, something happening in other countries, you don't avert your eyes just because it's, the UN Charter says, no, that's a sovereign country. No, you forget about it. So there is a global horizon of observation that has already emerged, and we are all part of it. The awareness that there are people on the other side of the planet cannot be undone. It's irreversible. So what I talked about, that human rights as the basic model, is the post-national membership model in scholarship that has emerged. It also talks about how it's a denationalizing model. That is, by denationalization, it's the ascriptive side of nationalism, which is ethnicity and language and memory and memory-based citizenship. So now, what's the second response? And this is so it's not a flight of fancy. You see, this is happening. So the second response is dual and multiple nationality. Citizenships are rising. So if you look at the chart, my student and I have gathered a lot of data on this too. So if you look, it starts rising. number of countries from the 1960s, 1910s that allow dual citizenship has been just going up and up. So it's more than 100 countries now that allow some form of, not all dual citizenships are created equal, but some form of dual citizenship, some form of rights. And I'll introduce it, later on, I'll introduce as a virtual basket of rights that becomes available. But if you go to early 20th century, and if you look at even the League of Nations documents, you realize that dual nationality was almost an anathema. Like, you cannot have, it was a national security matter. So it actually instructs that a person can have only one and only one nationality. The League of Nations document. So you see that pressure on the nation state and the nation states themselves. So what is it? Why is it changing? Why are the countries relinquishing this monopoly over citizenship? If someone is a citizen of two countries, you don't have the monopoly over that person's relationship with the state. As people say, many of my friends say, oh, if someone gets elected, they're going to move to Canada. So that kind of, that availability to be able to accept it by another state is rising. So how do they do it? So I have done also an in-depth study of the Indian case, which has been my focus. So I've been collecting data for all the countries, the laws of all the countries, but also I did this more ethnographic work in India. And you realize that, and this is another way to think, actually, even flawed democracies have a much higher rate of allowing dual citizenship. So if you see, democratic regimes are depicted by a red bar here, and they have a much larger leeway. So you can also see how authoritarian regimes are less willing to let go of that monopoly over citizenship. So this case about India, so India started flirting with the idea of dual citizenship in the early 2000s, and they formed a high-level committee on the Indian diaspora, and they had things like, it's so widespread, the Indian diaspora is so widespread that the sun never sets on the Indian diaspora. They turned the tables on the British. Wherever there is sun, there is some Indian diaspora always there. So the idea began based on ethnicity. That, okay, these ethnic diaspora, ethnic, and they should be allowed to have, and they had pictures of pride in that report, people who won Nobel Prizes, people who left India, became citizens of other countries, but when, were known for winning Nobel Prizes and things like that. So that, but if you look at it, it's hard to know. Again, the state was thinking in two different ways. Because if the basis was ethnic, why would they allow only a few countries initially? For example, Indians living in Australia, Canada, Finland, Ireland, Italy, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and the US, right? But Indian diaspora is everywhere. The sun never sets on it, so why are they just allowing a few of them? So of course there was a hue and cry. Then the second round they allowed Israel, New Zealand, Cyprus, Sweden, Switzerland, France, Greece, and Portugal. But then again, people in other countries like, what about us? So they have been so you see the pressure, how the government is slowly relinquishing its monopoly. So now OCI, which is Overseas Citizenship of India, does not extend to a person who's or had been at any time a citizen of Pakistan and Bangladesh. But other than that, everyone is allowed. Right? But the real reason is on this second line, which is investment. So India has ambitious plans to increase, and this is all from the report, right? About 20 million Indians live abroad. And a lot of philanthropy can be targeted, it could be directed towards India. If the government can actually milk this diaspora, right? So the idea is quite different here. It's less ethnic. So, of course, you see remittances. Remittances have been rising since these efforts began. And in 2011-12, they surpassed $60 billion, right? But they are still not able to tap. See, most of the remittances are still coming from Indian nationals living in the Gulf countries. So they still want to tap the people living in the West, so many Indians and millions of them. So that's still going on, and they're very attractive deposit schemes for them. You get higher interest rates if you invest there. So see, the state mechanisms are changing, and they're allowing. And by allowing you to have some citizenship rights, not all, and we'll come to that. So to do that, and I interviewed these people, the Indian government created this foundation, the Government Foundation, which is acting as a non-governmental organization. It's called India Development Foundation. And it is actually, it is registering itself in every country as a nonprofit, right? And the effort is going on. And the key, of course, is, if you can, I'm not sure if you can read it, the Indian Development Foundation of Overseas Indians is your window to partner in the India story. And so the story is, and I'm giving you the kind of more kind of grounded details so that we know what actually is happening in these in these transformations. So when I was interviewing the CEO of this India Development Foundation, he said, actually, it's not just about money. We want, quite like what China is doing, a lot of countries, the Philippines is doing, that we also want the talent that's sitting abroad. They should bring their technological know-how. People also want to, partner in a development cause. For example, they want to, they don't have any feelings for the whole of the country as a nation, but they may have feeling for their village, for their city. They might want to do something about that. So they're creating a window so that someone from Tamil Nadu, a state in India, can reach to a Tamil village and start a new school or a hospital. And they are wealthy, and this guy, was telling me that, within an hour in this diasporic meeting, and they hold this kind of big NRI day, non-resident Indian day in India every year. Within an hour, he had $50 million immediately, pledged by really wealthy Indians. I mean, we're talking about really wealthy Indians, people who created Hotmail and things like that, right? So now I want to shift to the idea. So what's actually happening if no longer citizenship is not based in a sovereign nationality? That is, you can have multiple allegiances. What does it mean then? What is citizenship then? Is it the same container model we can keep applying, that you're either a member or you're not a member? But again, if we look at on the ground, and some of the scholarships already suggest that human rights, based on human rights, but I'm extending it to other kinds of rights. So what I'm suggesting is that we should think of citizenship as a virtual basket of rights that we all carry around us. You and I, everyone, whenever we go. If you travel abroad, you go to Scotland, you go to Ireland, England, anywhere. You go Afghanistan, Israel. Your basket of right keeps shifting. It shifts. Let's say you're going to Ireland and you have dual nationality of Ireland and the US. Your basket of rights is way bigger than mine. I would be a tourist. I'll have very limited. You could actually vote. You could do everything that any Irish citizen could do there. So this basket shrinks and expands depending on how we move. It's a dynamically changing basket. So the idea is that, look, so I would say even visa holders have a basket of rights. So that also is a citizenship. Let's look at that. If you're a permanent resident, let's say you're coming from India or England or let's say any other state, and you are here as a permanent resident with a green card or as H-1B visa holder, your baskets are quite different. To just give an example. So as a permanent resident, you have a right to work, you have permanent residency, you have mobility rights, unhindered, right to exit and come back and return. You have social rights, civil rights, but no political rights, right? You still cannot vote in an election or hold a public office, right? So see, the basket is there. But if you're an H-1B visa holder, you do have a lot of rights. You have right to work, but, and here's a big but, it's only for maximum for 6 years, right? It's also location and time limited. So there's a there's a location-based application that you have to make to the government. That this person, the corporation has to say that this person will be working only in this location. And if they move their location, they have to reapply to get the permission for moving the location. So both temporally and spatially, it's limited, the right to work. Just one example. You have mobility rights, but those are also limited, and they are limited by time between the borders. You also won't have mobility rights. Let's say you're a green card holder. You can go to Europe. You can go to Schengen countries. But as an H-1B visa holder, you cannot, right? So your basket of rights, depending on where you go, it changes depending on your status. But of course, for both of them, in India, you still have all the political rights, all the civil rights, all social rights, and mobility rights that you keep intact because you're still an Indian citizen. This also changes if you become an American citizen. Then you have those rights in the US, but you lose some of those rights. You no longer have political rights in India. You cannot vote. But if you're an Irish dual citizen, you could. So again, every country, every state is now slicing and dicing this pie of rights that you can have, this basket. And that's where our focus should be, because that's where the real battles have to be fought, for the expansion of the basket, right? And that's part of my framework here. Then there are other kinds of rights that are emerging. Bilateral contracts between states. So India has, for example, and a lot of countries are doing it, and they have these treaties between nations about equal treatment of nationals, taxation, employment rights, and benefits, as well as welfare rights, right? So I'll give you just an example. I took picture shots. I'll just read one little thing. So this is between bilateral contract between social security agreement between Finland and India. And it says, I'll read number 2. The old age, survivors, and disability benefits due by virtue of the legislation of one contracting state are paid to the nationals of the other contracting state residing in the territory of a third state under the same conditions as if they were nationals of the first contracting state. So pretty good equal treatment and lavish. So those kind of contracts, but only strong states are being able to do it. They are having these contracts among themselves, right? So they're expanding the basket of their citizens in some ways, but other states are not. So we can think of it that what was a kind of rights regime that was coalesced, that was one little thing, blob. Now it's kind of differentiating, and some states are allowing some rights, but they are not allowing other rights. And they're fragmenting more and more. So if you look at the rights themselves are becoming more and more in number, and here we have to actually congratulate a lot of non-governmental organizations, because many people are fighting, many organizations are fighting for these rights. They are making them a reality. They're trying to expand the basket. So NGOs at some level already understand it. They already get it, that it's no longer about being in or out. It's about how much more right you can get for your population of interest. So just few examples, and then we can start the Q&A. So there are different types of weak. I call so from strong citizenship. I'm calling it a weak citizenship that we are. So I give the term after a famous sociology article, the strength of weak citizenship. That weak citizenship, which is not strong based on blood or soil, but these abstract rights that are emerging here and there. That weak citizenship, some could be diaspora-based, as I gave you examples already. For example, the Philippines and Ireland have these. So just to read you the Philippines one, the natural-born citizens, by reason of their naturalization as citizens of a foreign country, are hereby deemed to have reacquired the Philippine citizenship. That's in the 2003 Act, right? Similarly, you have Ireland, which is a modified jus soli, and if you have questions, you can ask about it. So basket there, you also get suffrage rights. You still cannot hold public office. It's so slightly different in every country. And this is what I'm working on this research project to map it all out. Everywhere it slightly shifts. It doesn't mean the same thing. So you can keep 2 passports there. Here too, you can keep 2 passports. For example, in India's case, you cannot have 2 passports. India doesn't allow that. So Indian overseas citizenship exists as a stamp on your US passport. So the same way with suffrage rights, India doesn't give you suffrage rights to dual nationals, right? But a country like Ireland opens up other gates. For example, the EU opens up for you with Irish citizenship. So you can live, educate, work, borrow, retire, have pension there. So all those things open up. A different kind of basket gets available to you. The second citizenship is citizenship, I call it class-based citizenship. So rich people are buying citizenship. I mean literally. They're buying citizenship of different countries. So just to give you a couple of examples, Malta started in 2000, right? For 650,000 euros, and if you purchase a property of about 350 euros, you're in. You can even vote. You just have a little bit of residency requirement, I think. After 6 months, during the 18-month period prior to the election, you can actually start voting. So they say it's real citizenship. It's not that fake ones that others are offering. We're offering you a real one. So a lot of Gulf nationals are buying those citizenships. Because you might think, Malta is a small country, who cares, if you're a citizen there? No, it again, like Ireland, it opens the gates to Europe. You become a European citizen, the EU member, right? So Maltese citizenship has, so US, as usual, always is the kind of, on the cutting edge. We were the first to start it all. So in 1990, we started, 1990, I think, but it says 1992 here. EB-5 visa program. So EB-5 visa program is if you invest, if anyone, and I know a couple of wealthy Indians who have done it. They have actually, in my city, Milwaukee, they have invested $1 million. And which means, and if it creates 10 full-time jobs directly or indirectly, then they qualify for something called green card, or which is pretty much half citizenship, as we can say. And why people are doing it? People want to educate their kids. They want the visas for their kids and green cards for their kids under 18 years of age. So a lot of people have been using the EB-5 visa program. Similarly, now let's move to, okay, so, and this citizenship by purchase is actually, it's growing. You can see after 2010, it has gone beyond more than 50 countries are offering it. Some sort of citizenship through investment. So now you have started believing me a little bit now that citizenship is changing. It's no longer our old sovereignty-based, model. So it's already shifting. The key is to understand it, the changing framework, that how we are moving away from the model of mold to modulation. The mold is that, okay, here's the country, here's the container. Either you're a member or you're not. But now it's modulation. Your rights are modulated. You are a member, you're not a member, it almost doesn't matter. So the third kind of citizenship, I can say, weak citizenship, would be based on merit. So if you look at Australia and Canada are prime examples, even Europe is offering that EU membership, which is based on skills. Australia and Canada literally give you points for knowing English, for knowing something, your skills, whether you're a master's or PhD. So these qualifications add up your points, and we can gain citizenship. We become eligible for citizenship there. So that's another kind of, basket that's emerging. Now, coming to a close, so this is what I call weak citizenship. It's differential, and it's a regime of context-dependent access, right? Now, in this model, the states are still very powerful, as we see. They are the ones who are deciding what rights to offer and how and whether to enforce them, right? So the states in this, so people who say the state is just going to wither away, at least I don't see it happening anytime soon. Then you have negotiators of rights. A lot of international NGOs and NGOs in different kinds, they're negotiating the kind of rights for the newer kind of populations. You have the United Nations as a big actor. You have Without Borders movement, which is very big in terms of understanding these things. And they might be the ones who might be advocating for, they might bring abuses to light and clamor for certain kind of rights for their populations, right? So citizenship in this model is access to resources in both political, social, civil, and all kinds of participation. And it's virtual and actual. It's actual only when you are in a particular state's control, where in the US, it's the US government's things that, but now with online stuff, you could be using some of your economic rights in India while you're in the US. So those kind of developments are allowing us to think of citizenship at a distance, which is activated online or on-site entry into an affiliative setting. I think this should be the last. So how do you think? How do we think about it now? So we can think of citizenship as substantive and formal. So what we have grown up with is the citizenship old model. It still persists. But that's formal. Formal in the sense that if you're a prisoner, you can be a formal citizen of the US, but you hardly have any rights. Forget about mobility rights. You don't have any rights. If you're homeless, you don't have rights. You have rights on paper, but you cannot access, you really don't have access to those resources, right? So, and this is the old conundrum. This is not what I'm, discovering it, Scholars 100 years ago have talked about this problem of formal citizenship versus substantive citizenship. But if we move to the virtual, basket of right model, you realize that in my mind, actually, a homeless person or a prisoner literally have a smaller basket of right. He or she is less of a citizen of this country and actually has much less freedoms than an H-1B visa holder would have, who is not a formal citizen of the US. So what does citizenship mean, a formal citizenship, if you can't access those rights? So the question becomes, how we expand that basket? We suddenly know, we have the term now, that formal citizenship was all BS, actually, for most of the people. I mean, it was not, inequality was never part of it. How to take care of inequalities of various kinds, where you are a formal citizen, but you cannot exercise those rights. The second point, then, about this kind of citizenship, and thinking about it in real terms, not as just in fantastical terms, is thinking of citizenship, because citizenship, the model citizen or denizen they have emerged, are part of this model of mold, right? A container model where you are, you belong, you're a citizen of something, right? But in my model, you're not citizen of a state. It's not a membership model. You're not a member of a polity, which is the model still being used in a lot of scholarship. This model is more about citizenship as a measurement. You can have more or less of citizenship. It's a measurement. So it changes the quality of your existence, literally, and quality of your access to rights. Because membership model no longer gives us the tools to understand what a person is actually going through, what they're up to, what they're up against. So with this model, hopefully, we can start thinking in a different way. So just to sum up, so we discussed the paradoxes, based on territory, identity, and nation states. Then we discussed how immigrants, particularly, are susceptible to these paradoxes and the adverse effects of these paradoxes. Then we also saw the rise of dual and multiple citizenships that's already happening, and how the model of weak citizenship, and weak citizenship doesn't sound good, I agree, but it is something for us all to think about in this global age. Because again, it's a stateless world society. There will be never a world government that governs everything. At least it doesn't look like. So how to think of global citizenship without the world government, without the world republic? So Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, thought that the model of cosmopolitan citizenship will be based on, somehow related to the world republic. Although his genius lied, that he did think, his genius lay in this idea that you can think of citizenship not only in terms of states, but also a citizenship of persons who are directly connected with this world republic. So he gave us a lead, and we are still working on those ideas. So if you have now, so I hope this idea was clear, and if you have now any questions, please feel free to ask.